Lees-Galloway.
At 5 minutes in length, Mr Okenvold's speech was quite a lengthy one for the kind of contributions he normally makes to the House. I wonder if he's preparing himself for life in opposition in the near future. Look, Mr Speaker, I've struggled to find much which is positive about this legislation. But in the last 20 minutes or so, I have discovered something that is positive about it, and that is that it is not ruthless enough to meet New Zealand First's particular prescription for immigration and asylum seeker policy. So there you go. There is one redeeming feature about this legislation, is that it's not tough enough for Winston. Mr Speaker, I actually think that this legislation represents two of the most odious characteristics of politics anywhere in the world, really. There are things that politicians like to dabble in that are utterly disgraceful, and the first is fear-mongering, and the second is targeting vulnerable populations, and this piece of legislation does both of those. It really is nothing more than a distraction from the series of scandals that the government has faced, and there's no better way to distract the public than to raise the fear that there is going to be, boatloads of people appearing on our shores and causing havoc in our nation. That we won't be able to deal with them. We won't know what to do with them. I don't know. They'll take our jobs and our houses and everything else. So there's this raising of the fear level, but also really, creating quite a draconian situation for these incredibly vulnerable people who, if they did actually manage to find their way all the way to New Zealand, don't need to be locked up in a detention centre. They will be in need of pretty high level and acute medical attention, I should think, and a serious amount of care. That is the principle that we should be adopting if considering any legislation to deal with asylum seekers. It has been said a number of times that it is incredibly unlikely that people will arrive en masse by sea in particular. But that in and of itself isn't necessarily a reason to oppose this legislation. It is a reason to point out that it's nothing more than a distraction, and that it's probably unnecessary and shouldn't be one of the government's priorities, and there are a whole lot of other things the government could have been doing rather than wasting its time on this legislation. But it's not really the reason to oppose it. The reason to oppose it is it simply won't work. The experience from overseas, particularly our closest neighbours, Australia, is that draconian legislation and the threat of being locked away in detention centres, and the threat of having your human rights eroded, and the threat of a long and arduous process once you actually land in the country that you are wishing to seek asylum in, actually does absolutely nothing to stop either the asylum seekers or the loathsome people smugglers that I have heard members opposite speak at length about, because they don't care about the legislative framework in the country that they are seeking asylum in. The people smugglers certainly don't. All they care about is extracting money from the people who wish to make that journey, and it really doesn't matter what we put in place at this end. It won't stop those people. And the fact is that the situations that true asylum seekers are trying to escape are far more terrible than anything that this legislation could put in front of them. And so they will still try to get away from those situations and seek asylum in other countries. So, really, this does nothing other than putting up costs for the New Zealand taxpayer. Because it's estimated that in Australia, the cost of detention is $137,317 per person. That's more than it costs us to keep people in prisons each year. So if we really are anticipating huge numbers of people coming to New Zealand, washing up on our shores, who will then be processed and sent to Waihuru to be kept in a detention centre built by Serco, then it is going to cost the New Zealand taxpayer in the order of $140,000 a year to do so. What's been proven in Australia and in other countries, that processing people in a community-based arrangement is 90% cheaper. And, frankly, it's just a better way of doing things. It is the New Zealand way of doing things, not the Australian way, not the American way, the British way, or any other way, or anybody else that the Prime Minister is trying to impress with this legislation. We should be doing things the New Zealand way. And the New Zealand way is to be a good neighbour to the other nations in our region and around the world. We have an excellent international reputation for being peacekeepers and a peace-loving nation and a friendly, safe and secure nation. And this this approach of putting up barbed fences or metaphorical barbed wire fences around our country and trying to act like the big bullies that do exist around the world is going to do us no favours on the international stage and does our reputation no favours whatsoever, and it won't work. It won't actually achieve the outcomes that the proponents of this bill say it will. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have tried to work with the government. Darian Fenton tried to sit down and actually reach a cross-party consensus around how we would deal with asylum seekers. Darian Fenton and other members of the opposition, Jan Logie, have put up amendments that would soften some of the harder edges of this legislation and actually make it a little bit more sensible, such as making it a requirement that the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Centre be the place in which, in the first instance, asylum seekers would be kept, because their needs are quite different from other people that we detain. They're quite different from people who end up in police cells or people who end up in prisons. There is always enormous mental health issues that need to be dealt with. We know that before people arrive, from the situations that they've escaped and the harrowing journeys that they have embarked upon, psychological illness, trauma, depression, anxiety are all acutely manifest in those groups. And of course, detention only serves to exacerbate all of those problems. They're also likely to have other physical, emotional and psychological problems. And the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Centre is actually the one place that is ideally set up to deal with all of those issues. And the Minister himself actually said that he thought that that was what was likely to happen, but he wasn't prepared to codify that in law. In other words, they want the ability to be able to ship people off to a place like Waihuru and put them up in a military detention centre and hide them away from the general public, as though sending them to Waihuru means the problem is no longer there. So if that wasn't the Minister's intention, he would have supported Darian Fenton's amendment and we would have been able to improve the bill in that way. And Darian Fenton's other amendment would have required individual assessment to meet our obligations to use detention only where necessary. So we could have had some asylum seekers who might have been determined to be of higher risk put in detention, whereas most others could have been put into a community-based approach to processing. All of these things, plus Jan Logie's amendments, would have improved this bill, but that's improving this bill and getting good legislation and getting a good framework around how we process asylum seekers and how we deal with the question of who is a genuine asylum seeker was not the aim of this bill, sir. The aim of this bill was to pick on some of the most vulnerable people in the world, let alone in our community and in our country, and to provide a distraction from the failings of this government and all the scandals and problems that have confronted this government over the last 12 to 18 months. So, sir, it should come as no surprise to you or anybody else out there listening that Labor is fundamentally opposed to this legislation.
Well spoken.
Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Ken Calder.
Mr. Speaker, I find myself actually agreeing with